Welcome back. To move from Machiavelli and Hobbes to Montaigne and Pascal, as we do in this lecture, is to change not just writers, but really whole experiences of reading. The France of Montaigne and Pascal was simply far richer and more ornate and significantly less existentially fraught than either Machiavelli's Italy or Hobbes's England. Furthermore, moving from Machiavelli and Hobbes to Montaigne and Pascal is a matter of changing styles and approaches and topics as well. Machiavelli and Hobbes were both resolutely public writers. Their work, even The Prince, right, is meant to be read as if it were spoken in the midst of the prince's court or the floor of Parliament. Montaigne and Pascal are profoundly private writers, deeply focused on anathematizing the weather of their own souls, apparently indifferent to the vast geopolitical scale that Hobbes and Machiavelli write at. Now we'll see, of course, that their apparent indifference to these larger themes is more a mask than a reality, but nonetheless, at least on their surface, they're quite different in that way. And yet for all those differences, they too have a profound interest in the nature and character of human malice and suffering. And the lessons that they draw from it are as much personal, are as much political as they are personal. Most centrally, Montaigne and Pascal have a debate about the complicated and intricate connections between religious belief, the self, and the self's performance of its beliefs in the world. Most centrally, for both Montaigne and Pascal, the main question is about the dangers of zealotry, of serious religious belief, as it is for Montaigne, or the dangers of the lack of zealotry, as it is for Pascal. Now, the questions they both ask are of a more interior, personal, and brooding nature. And yet, there are some powerful resonances between them nonetheless. They never met, of course, but Pascal was an enormous admirer of Montaigne's writing, disagreed with him profoundly, but nonetheless understood what he was about and took him on his own terms in a very interesting way. For both of them lived in a world that was not so much politically turbulent. There was a bit of political turbulence for Montaigne, but not so much, but more religiously pluralistic. Their France was more religiously pluralistic than it would be until maybe today. France in the late 16th, early 17th century was one of the main areas where Protestants and Catholics tried to get along. And among the people who tried to help them get along, Michel de Montaigne is one of the greatest. Montaigne is one of the most profound students of the effects of our beliefs on others, particularly how our beliefs may cause others to suffer great evils. He lived in an age of hyper-zealotry, though he did not himself share in that zealotry. He had a really interesting upbringing. He was born in 1533 to a very wealthy merchant family that had sort of bought into the French nobility. Immediately after his birth, he was sent by his father to live with a peasant family, where he lived until he was 3 years old. His father wanted to make him acclimated to peasant life, to make him appreciate peasant life. Then he was brought back to his house, to his father's house, where he was raised by his father entirely in Latin and Greek. His father never spoke French to him. In fact, even the servants were required to speak only Latin to him. You know, things are pretty different now. It's pretty hard, actually, to find a good Latin-speaking butler these days. But inevitably, with an upbringing like this, he was not only strange, he was very precocious. He was a lawyer in his teens. He was a counselor to a count, and then ultimately a courtier to the French king Charles IX, all before he was 30. He was marked out for remarkable advancement and prestige in the French noble world. Then, when he was 30, suddenly, without any expectation, his closest friend, Etienne de la Boétie, died, suddenly and without warning. It was devastating for Montaigne, who thought of Boétie as a second self. He never fully recovered his public presence. He married soon after the death, and then, in 1571, at the age of 38, after slowly, over the course of several years, extricating himself from public affairs, he retired fully from public life, literally locking himself in a tower on his estate, out of which he emerged, even for his family, only very rarely, and even then only with the greatest reluctance. After almost 10 years of near total isolation, he published the first edition of his book, Essays. Paradoxically, for so determined a recluse, the Essays by Montaigne is the first work of genuinely revelatory exploration of a private self written for public reading. Just think about that for a second. It's a very weird paradox. This is a guy who basically spent 10 years locked in a tower on his own with books and paper. And what does he do in those 10 years? He produces a book which is all about his inner life. We can understand that if you're locked alone in a room for 10 years, you're not going to have much else to think about, but still, why would you then publish it? It's a pretty odd thing that someone so private in person could be so self-revelatory between the covers of a book. In a way, Montaigne, modernity's first reclusive artist in any genre, painter, musician, writer, what have you, the first truly reclusive artist, is also the modern world's first truly literary confessionalist. Now, after the publication of the Essays, the first edition of the Essays, Montaigne traveled for a couple years for his health. He was, understandably, after 10 years in a tower, somewhat ill. And then he was unwillingly elected the mayor of Bordeaux, the town outside of which he lived. And he served in that post as a moderate, trying to balance the demands and the needs of his own Roman Catholic community and the Protestant Huguenot community from 1581 to 1585, when he retired again to his tower to continue his own writing and rewriting of the Essays. He died in 1592. Now, Montaigne's work takes up remarkably contemporary topics, like religious extremism and terrorism. Much like Machiavelli, he saw himself as a realist who sees what is, but he's much more of a self-focused realist, a miniaturist of the soul, so to speak, than Machiavelli ever was. The theme that emerges throughout the Essays is the tension, one theme that emerges throughout the Essays, is the tension between the vehemence of one's beliefs and the reality of the world's apparent indifference to those beliefs, and the way that those vehement beliefs can lead to horrific suffering on the part of others. Now, in thinking about how he made this argument, you have to understand something of the genre in which he's writing. He writes essays. In fact, he's really the first person to coin this phrase, to write in this genre. These are not treatises like Hobbes or a brief programmatic book like Machiavelli's Prince. Essays are truly efforts whose profundity and whose ultimate punch is really actually masked, at first anyway, by an apparent casualness, an easiness of flitting from one topic to another, so that people are led through some complicated and quite profound matters by feeling like they're in the midst of a loose and wandering conversation, an after-dinner conversation about a number of things. Oh, I've heard of this. I've heard of that. Well, that makes me think of this. Montaigne, in fact, coined the term essays. In French, it means attempts or efforts, and effectively remains one of the greatest masters of the genre. And in fact, his style matters very much to the point he's trying to make. Attention to the banalities of life, everyday life, the accretion of experience, attention to the details of how we dress every morning, what we wear, how we walk. When we start walking, do we start with our right foot or our left foot? When I scratch my head, how hard do I scratch? These are sorts of things that Montaigne talks about. And attention to these banalities, Montaigne thinks, teaches us much. Much more, in fact, than attention to abstract dogmas or doctrines of philosophical theories. Because through these banalities, we will discover how we actually behave. And that's crucial for him. Essays are focused on the ordinary aspects of our lives, and they can track this behavior very well. What do we see when we do this, when we track our behavior? We see, above all, this. Humans are messy and jumbled, completely more or less ramshackle assemblages of desires, interests, thoughts, more or less coherent, but fundamentally not very aligned properly in ourselves. To deny our messiness, to try to fix it, Montaigne suggests, leads inevitably to mutilation and evil. But, and here Montaigne is a child of the Renaissance as much as Calvin, his fellow Frenchman, whom Montaigne read with interest, though not with assent, much as Calvin was. For Montaigne, the human mind far outreaches the body and is in a constant turmoil of invention and creativity. Again, much like Calvin, though from a very different angle, Montaigne worries about the turbulent creativity of the human imagination, for it can and does lead us to profoundly anti-humane, anti-worldly, evil beliefs and behaviors. And in a series of essays within the larger essays, two of which I want to pick out in particular, Montaigne analyzes the ways in which our zealous, hyper-sincere piety, our vehemently held beliefs, can at times be destructive on their own or curdle into a kind of hatred which is even more evil than their direct expression would be. In one essay, for example, an essay entitled, innocently, Of Virtue, Montaigne tells the story of the amazing things he knows people can do. And he starts with some interesting examples of strength and stuff, and then he seems to veer off topic, and he talks about a series of increasingly outlandish behaviors he's heard of. A man who is nagged by his wife so much because she is so jealous of his leaving their house and talking to other women that eventually one day he has enough and takes a knife and cuts off his own penis and gives it to her. Montaigne is astonished by this. But then he says, oh, but wait, I've heard another story. A man who disappointed his mistress in bed and went home in shame and decided that the way to solve this problem is, again, to cut off his own penis and mail it to her. Montaigne goes from that to think, what about widows who throw themselves in India on the pyres of their husbands? What about those among us who have been willing to die for our beliefs in horrible ways, in our own pyres of fire? You notice how he shifted from outlandish stories of what happened in the neighborhood? Now he's talking about religious zealotry in his own area. Then he says, oh, and then I've heard of this man, the first man to actually manage to kill William the Silent. There's a Dutch leader. A Catholic managed to kill this guy, this Protestant leader. And instead of trying to run away, he stood there and waited to be captured. Montaigne says, there must be a kind of virtue in this, although I suspect that, in fact, we would all find it somewhat troubling. What's happened? He's now identified a person who, for the Roman Catholic world, is a remarkable martyr and a hero. This guy who goes and kills a political leader and then stands there and is willing to be tortured and killed for his beliefs. He's connected that with an angry peasant who cuts off his own penis when he's nagged by his wife. And he suggests that these two people are connected by a common thread. That is, the thread of extremity. Perhaps, he's suggesting in this essay, the extremities of our lives are less attractive when we think about them in a careful way than they seem to be in abstraction. In a second essay, building on this in some ways, called Of Moderation, he reflects on a saying he's heard. The saying is, the archer who shoots too far misses, just like one who shoots too close. Right? In other words, it is just as possible to go extreme and miss your target as it is to not be ambitious enough and miss your target. Nature, he says, including human nature, is moderate, but the human mind need not be moderate. This is our glory and our tragedy, he thinks. And our imagination is so fertile that we are prone to bouts of thought that can lead to self-annihilation and other annihilation as well. We need to be reminded again and again that even though our mind is in some sense limitless, our bodies and our world are not. And we need to keep things under control, in moderate ranges, not to go extreme. Because when we go extreme, we annihilate ourselves and we annihilate others. This self and other annihilation, this tendency humans have to a vehement, zealous destructiveness, horrifies and intrigues Montaigne. Why are we like this, he wonders. Most basically, he thinks, we are like this because we hate messiness. We hate our messiness, our muddiness, and we love purity. We love extremity. We love simple answers and final solutions. Humans are messy creatures in a messy world, but we hate it. We want tidiness. We want things to be neat and orderly. We want things to be black or white, simple and straightforward. Many of us, he thinks, would rather castrate ourselves or kill ourselves. Many of us would definitely kill others than accept the messiness of our world. That's an astonishing fact, that we are so extreme that we cannot, in fact, tolerate complexity, even when that complexity is itself extreme complexity. That's the complicated fact of our lives. We are people who live moderate lives, but we want to live on the extremes. Now, in all this, Montaigne is the pioneer of a certain kind of moderation and a certain kind of skepticism about zealotry of any sort, an extremism of any sort, political, religious, athletic. Any kind of monomaniacal focus on anything is the kind of thing that Montaigne worries about. And he is the pioneer of this. Others came after him, and others are still working today, worrying in some ways that religious extremism, for example, is the philosophical and psychological source of a lot of the evils in our world. There's clearly something to that. Perhaps Montaigne's most famous and remarkable intellectual follower in this way is a person who those of us who live in the United States don't know much about, the famous French diplomat Charles de Talleyrand-Périgord, who astonishingly served and survived as Secretary of State in France under Louis XVI, then the revolutionary regime, then Napoleon, then finally the restored Bourbon monarchy. Talleyrand's famous house motto, "Surtout pas trop de zèle," above all, not too much zeal, is in some ways a perfect epitome of Montaigne's view. And Talleyrand's efforts throughout his life to create a stable European order in the midst of a revolutionary era would be exactly the sort of thing that Montaigne would have approved of. Would that we had Talleyrand's today in our world. But along with Montaigne, another, and I would say personally, equally necessary voice in this conversation on the other side is Blaise Pascal, one of the greatest intellects of European history. He was a brilliant mathematician and scientist. Born in 1623, and he died when he was only 39 in 1662. Like a lot of these people, Pascal died when he was younger than I am today. I can hardly deal with that. He was a renowned child prodigy. He became famous for science and mathematics. He invented, in fact, the very first calculating machine. At 23, in 1646, he became associated with the Jansenists, a very hyper-Augustinian religious movement within the Roman Catholic Church, but one that was in deep conflict with the Jesuits, who at that time had the king's ear in France. So Pascal began to be on the outs with the French establishment, intellectual as well as political. In 1654, on November 23rd of that year, As a matter of fact, between 10:30 p.m. and a half past midnight, he had a radically powerful religious conversion. We know about this, and we know with such precision about the time of this conversion, because it seems the very next day, or maybe that night, he wrote out a note about it and dated it, and then sewed it into his doublet, the vest respectable 17th century gentleman wore. He sewed it into his doublet, where it was discovered after his death. Now, Pascal is most well known today for his Pensées, his book of thoughts. That's what pensée means in French. It's a collection of aphorisms that are more or less jumbled that Pascal was working on when he died. He had meant eventually to organize them into an argument for the truth of Christianity, an argument that he hoped would turn some of his readers, anyway, back to God in repentance and inspire in them a desire for a truly Christian life. Now, in the Pensées, he appears to be, and proves himself to be, I should say, one of the greatest anatomists of the dimensions of self-deception that are so pervasive in evil. There, in that work, in the small excerpts that would one day have gone into that work, had he lived, we see human self-deception analyzed with the most acuity, I think, that anyone has ever shown. Now, Pascal on evil is classically Augustinian. I mean, in some ways, he's kind of hyper-Augustinian. For him, he's not so much focused on the topic that interests Montaigne, the idea that religious belief manifests itself in cruelty to others. Pascal is interested more in the cruelty we show ourselves by not thinking about our religious beliefs. As I had said, he read Montaigne very closely, and he disagreed with him quite radically, even as he admired him. And Montaigne actually would not have found this disappointing. He would have liked it, because he knew, Montaigne did, that each author's words must be digested and modified in the guts of the living reader for them to become vital again. But most profoundly, Pascal disagreed with Montaigne about the relationship between serious religious belief and moral sanity, rectitude. Where Montaigne saw zealotry as dangerous, for Pascal, anything less than zealotry, anything less than what Montaigne would call zealotry, would be mere evasion of the realities confronting us. Now, Pascal's anthropology explains this a little bit. Remember I said that for Montaigne, humans are muddied, but they hate that about themselves. For Pascal, something about that is true, but the problem is that the muddiness is something we're not supposed to be. Humans are weak, frail, folly-filled creatures for Pascal, shadows of what they were meant to be. We are, he says famously, neither an angel nor a beast. We're filled with astonishing contradictions. And we possess no truth which is either abiding or fully satisfactory. We're moving constantly, turbulently in our minds, constantly turbulently in the world, trying to make sense of our world and finding no stable resting place within it. And this is not just like Montaigne, he's very much like Calvin as well. A lot of these people coming out of the Renaissance focus on this Renaissance theme of the creativity, the endless creativity of the human mind. But whereas other Renaissance thinkers seem to think that is an unremittingly positive thing about the human, thinkers that we've been looking at, Calvin, Montaigne, Pascal, they all identify the turbulence of the mind as one of the most profound modern innovations when it comes to thinking about the roots of evil. Now, the very magnitude of our lusts for Pascal, the endlessness of our perversity, teaches us something about the infinitude of our longing. It's a longing that can only be sated, this is very Augustinian, by the presence of God in our lives. As he famously said, I have discovered that all of mankind's evils come from one thing, that they do not know how to sit quietly in their own room. The key here is the human is an incoherent tangle, at least incoherent from the point of view of what we call the natural world, the order of creation, from where we stand. We desire truth and happiness, but are incapable of them. This desire, Pascal says, is left to us as much as punishment for our fall, as for a reminder of from whence we have fallen. Now, this is not just a bad thing about us. It's not just a sign of our misery. It's also a sign, importantly, of our grandeur. As Pascal says, to know that one is miserable is to be miserable, of course. But to know that one is miserable is also to be great. That is to say, to have the ability to not just experience yourself, but to kind of step back and experience yourself, experiencing yourself in that way. To actually have a sort of sideways on view of yourself, to be able to reflect on yourself in the moment, is a gift of human beings and a feature of our creation that is distinctive about us and truly magnificent, Pascal thinks. Now, our lives are riddled with sin, governed by our sinful refusal to recognize that sinfulness. And the first step, therefore, in our healing must be that recognition of our sinfulness, our vanity, the emptiness of so much of what we do. Only then will the infinite abyss of longing that we have at our heart, only then will it be filled by the infinite gift of God. Until then, we will seek trying to fill it with other bad ends, bad happinesses. No natural science will understand the human. Something beyond nature is needed, a theological insight, he thinks. To understand ourselves, we need to listen to God then. The difficulty is, we find listening to God or listening to ourselves horrible. We find self-reflection incredibly painful and distasteful. We don't want rest. We don't want to contemplate. We have two secret instincts at war with one another. We want an end, but we don't want to reflect on ourselves wanting that end. We want to actively avoid thinking about ourselves. And it is in the study of this active ignorance, this active desire we have, unconscious, preconscious, what have you, that Pascal makes what I think is his most distinctive, most significant, and most abiding contribution to thinking about evil. For he diagnosed this active ignorance, this dynamic avoidance of ourselves, with a single devastating word: divertissement. Now, divertissement is diversion. These are diversions. We engage in our life in a series of diversions, a series of tricks that add up to a whole way of being in the world by way of avoiding confronting the basic facts, conditions, realities of our existence. Particularly, and most centrally, the fact of our inevitable death. Divertissement, for Pascal, is a certain culturally specific way for him of talking about humans how humans can lead a life fundamentally organized around avoiding what they should be doing. It is another language for describing the condition of humans caught in original sin. This language highlighting the active character of the endless round of empty frivolities we indulge in order to not think about what we should be thinking about. Now, Pascal uses this word very intentionally. It's a word of some common use in his France, as it would be today, diversions. It sounds light and harmless, but it needn't be so. Great evil, he thinks, can and does come from trivial causes. Dueling and murder, he says in the Pensée, both come from ennui, from boredom. And thus, Pascal thinks, the magnitude of the horrors that we produce are out of all proportion to the triviality of the cause. Divertissement. Now, it should be clear that this is a direct critique of Montaigne's view for being too forgiving and blind towards these trivial things. Pascal says it's precisely the trivial things you should worry about. At that level, you may be able to control it. Perhaps, just perhaps, because even there it's going to be hard. But by the time you get to things where we already recognize real crimes, right? Or real catastrophes, mutilation, amputation, castration, murder, suicide, self-immolation, it's far too late to stop people from driving themselves straight to hell. So for Pascal, the issue is that people must finally confront the question of whether or not they will believe in God and confront God's commands for them. And it is only by being caught up in divertissement that we continue to avoid this. This is why zealotry is so dangerous for Pascal. Why zealotry is so necessary for Pascal, and why he opposes Montaigne's suspicion of it. Because we have to be serious, because in the end, life will come for us, and so will death. Pascal, then, lives after Montaigne in several senses. Where Montaigne is about diversity and acceptable incoherence and the messiness of human life, and for whom evil is an effect of denying that diversity and incoherence. Pascal thinks that human incoherence is itself an effect of human evil and fallenness. They directly disagree. In thinking about this disagreement, though, I urge you to keep both views alive, because it seems to me that both people have a good bit of evidence on their side. Now, next, I want to turn back to England and consider another Renaissance thinker, one who is enormously influential, but one whose influence is often not fully seen by us because we think of him fundamentally as just a poet, and that is John Milton.